Ireland is an island in the North Atlantic Ocean, in northwestern Europe. It is separated from Great Britain to its east by the North Channel, the Irish Sea, and St. George's Channel. Ireland is the second largest island of the British Isles, the third largest in Europe, and the 20th largest in the world. Geopolitically, the island of Ireland is divided between the Republic of Ireland, officially named Ireland, an independent state covering 5/6 of the island, and Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. As of 2022, the population of the entire island is just over 7 million, with 5.1 million living in the Republic of Ireland and 1.9 million in Northern Ireland, ranking it the second most populous island in Europe after Great Britain. The geography of Ireland comprises relatively low-lying mountains surrounding a central plain, with several navigable rivers extending inland. Its lush vegetation is a product of its mild but changeable climate, which is free of extremes in temperature. Much of Ireland was woodland until the end of the Middle Ages. Today, woodland makes up about 10% of the island, compared with a European average of over 33%, with most of it being non-native conifer plantations. The Irish climate is influenced by the Atlantic Ocean and thus very moderate, and winters are milder than expected for such a northerly area, although summers are cooler than those in continental Europe. Rainfall and cloud cover are abundant. Gaelic Ireland had emerged by the 1st century AD. The island was Christianized from the 5th century onwards. During this period, Ireland was divided into many petty kingships under provincial kingships vying for dominance and the title of High King of Ireland. In the late 8th century to early 11th century AD, Viking raids and settlement took place, culminating in the Battle of Clontarf on April 23, 1014, which resulted in the ending of Viking power in Ireland. Following the 12th century Anglo-Norman invasion, England claimed sovereignty. However, English rule did not extend over the whole island until the 16th to 17th century Tudor conquest, which led to colonization by settlers from Britain. In the 1690s, a system of Protestant English rule was designed to materially disadvantage the Catholic majority and Protestant dissenters, and was extended during the 18th century. With the Acts of Union in 1801, Ireland became a part of the United Kingdom. A war of independence in the early 20th century was followed by the partition of the island, leading to the creation of the Irish Free State, which became increasingly sovereign over the following decades until it declared a republic in 1948, and Northern Ireland, which remained a part of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland saw much civil unrest from the late 1960s until the 1990s. This subsided following the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. In 1973, both the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom, with Northern Ireland as part of it, joined the European Economic Community. Following a referendum vote in 2016, the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland included, left the European Union in 2020. Northern Ireland was granted a limited special status and allowed to operate within the EU single market for goods without being in the European Union. The economy has subsequently grown faster than the rest of the UK. Irish culture has had a significant influence on other cultures, especially in the field of literature. Alongside mainstream Western culture, a strong indigenous culture exists, as expressed through Gaelic games, Irish music, Irish language, and Irish dance. The island's culture shares many features with that of Great Britain, including the English language, and sports such as association football, rugby, horse racing, golf, and boxing. History. Prehistoric Ireland. During the last glacial period, and until about 16,000 BC, much of Ireland was periodically covered in ice. The relative sea level was less than 50 m lower, resulting in an ice bridge but not a land bridge forming between Ireland and Great Britain. By 14,000 BC this ice bridge existed only between Northern Ireland and Scotland, and by 12,000 BC Ireland was completely separated from Great Britain. Later, around 6100 BC, Great Britain became separated from continental Europe. Until recently, the earliest evidence of human activity in Ireland was dated at 12,500 years ago, demonstrated by a butchered bear bone found in a cave in County Clare. Since 2021, the earliest evidence of human activity in Ireland is dated to 33,000 years ago. By about 8000 BC, more sustained occupation of the island has been shown, with evidence for Mesolithic communities around the island. Sometime before 4000 BC, Neolithic settlers introduced cereal cultivars, domesticated animals such as cattle and sheep, built large timber buildings, and stone monuments. The earliest evidence for farming in Ireland or Great Britain is from Ferreter's Cove, County Kerry, where a flint knife, cattle bones and a sheep's tooth were carbon dated to c. 4350 BC. Field systems were developed in different parts of Ireland, including at the Seed Fields, that has been preserved beneath a blanket of peat in present-day Tyrol. An extensive field system, arguably the oldest in the world, consisted of small divisions separated by dry stone walls. The fields were farmed for several centuries between 3500 BC and 3000 BC. Wheat and barley were the principal crops. The Bronze Age began around 2500 BC, with technology changing people's everyday lives during this period through innovations such as the wheel, harnessing oxen, weaving textiles, brewing alcohol, and metalworking, which produced new weapons and tools, along with fine gold decoration and jewelry, such as brooches and torques. Emergence of Celtic Ireland. How and when the island became Celtic has been debated for close to a century, with the migrations of the Celts being one of the more enduring themes of archaeological and linguistic studies. The most recent genetic research strongly associates the spread of Indo-European languages including Celtic through Western Europe with the people bringing a composite beaker culture, with its arrival in Britain and Ireland dated to around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. According to John T. Cook and others, Ireland in the Late Bronze Age was part of a maritime trading network culture called the Atlantic Bronze Age that also included Britain, Western France, and Iberia, and that this is where Celtic languages developed. This contrasts with the traditional view that their origin lies in mainland Europe with the Hallstatt culture. The long-standing traditional view is that the Celtic language, Ogham script, and culture were brought to Ireland by waves of invading or migrating Celts from mainland Europe. This theory draws on the Lebergabula Éireann, a medieval Christian pseudo-history of Ireland, along with the presence of Celtic culture, language, and artifacts found in Ireland such as Celtic bronze spears, shields, torques and other finely crafted Celtic-associated possessions. The theory holds that there were 4 separate Celtic invasions of Ireland. The Prytany were said to be the first, followed by the Belgae from northern Gaul and Britain. Later, Lacan tribes from Armorica were said to have invaded Ireland and Britain more or less simultaneously. Lastly, the Milesians were said to have reached Ireland from either northern Iberia or southern Gaul. It was claimed that a second wave named the Urni, belonging to the Belgae people of northern Gaul, began arriving about the 6th century BC. They were said to have given their name to the island. The theory was advanced in part because of the lack of archaeological evidence for large-scale Celtic immigration, though it is accepted that such movements are notoriously difficult to identify. Historical linguists are skeptical that this method alone could account for the absorption of Celtic language, with some saying that an assumed processual view of Celtic linguistic formation is an especially hazardous exercise. Genetic lineage investigation into the area of Celtic migration to Ireland has led to findings that showed no significant differences in mitochondrial DNA between Ireland and large areas of continental Europe, in contrast to parts of the Y chromosome pattern. When taking both into account, a study concluded that modern Celtic speakers in Ireland could be thought of as European Atlantic Celts, showing a shared ancestry throughout the Atlantic zone from northern Iberia to western Scandinavia rather than substantially Central European. In 2012, research showed that the occurrence of genetic markers for the earliest farmers was almost eliminated by beaker culture immigrants. They carried what was then a new Y chromosome R1b marker, believed to have originated in Iberia about 2500 BC. The prevalence amongst modern Irish men of this mutation is a remarkable 84%, the highest in the world, and closely matched in other populations along the Atlantic fringes down to Spain. A similar genetic replacement happened with lineages in mitochondrial DNA. This conclusion is supported by recent research carried out by the geneticist David Reich, who says, British and Irish skeletons from the Bronze Age that followed the Beaker period had at most 10% ancestry from the first farmers of these islands, with other 90% from people like those associated with the Bell Beaker culture in the Netherlands. He suggests that it was Beaker users who introduced an Indo-European language, represented here by Celtic. Late Antiquity and early medieval times. The earliest written records of Ireland come from classical Greco-Roman geographers. Ptolemy in his Almagest refers to Ireland as Little Britain, in contrast to the larger island, which he called Great Britain. In his map of Ireland in his later work, Geography, Ptolemy refers to Ireland as Iurnia and to Great Britain as Albion. These new names were likely to have been the local names for the islands at the time. The earlier names, in contrast, were likely to have been coined before direct contact with local peoples was made. The Romans referred to Ireland by this name too in its Latinized form, Hibernia, or Scotia. Ptolemy records 16 nations inhabiting every part of Ireland in 100 AD. The relationship between the Roman Empire and the kingdoms of ancient Ireland is unclear. However, a number of finds of Roman coins have been made, for example at the Iron Age settlement of Freestone Hill near Gowran and Newgrange. Ireland continued as a patchwork of rival kingdoms. However, beginning in the 7th century, a concept of national kingship gradually became articulated through the concept of a High King of Ireland. Medieval Irish literature portrays an almost unbroken sequence of high kings stretching back thousands of years, but some modern historians believe the scheme was constructed in the 8th century to justify the status of powerful political groupings by projecting the origins of their rule into the remote past. All of the Irish kingdoms had their own kings but were nominally subject to the High King. The High King was drawn from the ranks of the provincial kings and ruled also the royal kingdom of Meath, with a ceremonial capital at the Hill of Tara. The concept did not become a political reality until the Viking Age, and even then was not a consistent one. Ireland did have a culturally unifying rule of law, the early written judicial system, the Brehon laws, administered by a professional class of jurists known as the Brehons. The Chronicle of Ireland records that in 431, Bishop Palladius arrived in Ireland on a mission from Pope Celestine I to minister to the Irish already believing in Christ. The same chronicle records that Saint Patrick, Ireland's best-known patron saint, arrived the following year. There is continued debate over the missions of Palladius and Patrick, but the consensus is that they both took place and that the older Druid tradition collapsed in the face of the new religion. Irish Christian scholars excelled in the study of Latin and Greek learning and Christian theology. In the monastic culture that followed the Christianization of Ireland, Latin and Greek learning was preserved in Ireland during the early Middle Ages in contrast to elsewhere in Western Europe, where the Dark Ages followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The arts of manuscript illumination, metalworking, and sculpture flourished and produced treasures such as the Book of Kells, ornate jewelry and the many carved stone crosses that still dot the island today. A mission founded in 563 on Iona by the Irish monk Saint Columbo began a tradition of Irish missionary work that spread Celtic Christianity and learning to Scotland, England, and the Frankish Empire on continental Europe after the fall of Rome. These missions continued until the late Middle Ages, establishing monasteries and centers of learning, producing scholars such as Sedulius Scotus and Johannes Eriugena and exerting much influence in Europe. From the 9th century, waves of Viking raiders plundered Irish monasteries and towns. These raids added to a pattern of raiding and endemic warfare that was already deep-seated in Ireland. The Vikings were involved in establishing most of the major coastal settlements in Ireland: Dublin, Limerick, Cork, Wexford, Waterford, as well as other smaller settlements. Norman and English invasions. On May 1, 1169, an expedition of Cambro-Norman knights, with an army of about 600 men, landed at Bannow Strand in present-day County Wexford. It was led by Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow owing to his prowess as an archer. The invasion, which coincided with a period of renewed Norman expansion, was at the invitation of Dermot mac Murrough, King of Leinster. In 1166, mac Murrough had fled to Anjou, France, following a war involving Tiernan Uaruerc of Briefn, and sought the assistance of the Angevin King Henry II, in recapturing his kingdom. In 1171, Henry arrived in Ireland in order to review the general progress of the expedition. He wanted to re-exert royal authority over the invasion which was expanding beyond his control. Henry successfully reimposed his authority over Strongbow and the Cambro-Norman warlords and persuaded many of the Irish kings to accept him as their overlord, an arrangement confirmed in the 1175 Treaty of Windsor. The invasion was legitimized by reference to provisions of the alleged papal bull Laudabiliter, issued by an Englishman, Adrian IV, in 1155. The document apparently encouraged Henry to take control in Ireland in order to oversee the financial and administrative reorganization of the Irish Church and its integration into the Roman Church system. Some restructuring had already begun at the ecclesiastical level following the Synod of Kells in 1152. There has been significant controversy regarding the authenticity of Laudabiliter, and there is no general agreement as to whether the bull was genuine or a forgery. Further, it had no standing in the Irish legal system. In 1172, Pope Alexander III further encouraged Henry to advance the integration of the Irish Church with Rome. Henry was authorized to impose a tithe of 1 penny per hearth as an annual contribution. This church levy, called Peter's Pence, is extant in Ireland as a voluntary donation. In turn, Henry assumed the title of Lord of Ireland, which Henry conferred on his younger son, John Lackland, in 1185. This defined the Anglo-Norman administration in Ireland as the Lordship of Ireland. When Henry's successor died unexpectedly in 1199, John inherited the crown of England and retained the Lordship of Ireland. Over the century that followed, Norman feudal law gradually replaced the Gaelic Brehon law across large areas, so that by the late 13th century the Norman Irish had established a feudal system throughout much of Ireland. Norman settlements were characterized by the establishment of baronies, manors, towns, and the seats of the modern county system. A version of Magna Carta, substituting Dublin for London and the Irish Church for the English Church at the time, the Catholic Church, was published in 1216 and the Parliament of Ireland was founded in 1297. Gallicization. From the mid-14th century, after the Black Death, Norman settlements in Ireland went into a period of decline. The Norman rulers and the Gaelic Irish elites intermarried and the areas under Norman rule became Gaelicized. In some parts, a hybrid Hiberno-Norman culture emerged. In response, the Irish Parliament passed the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1367. These were a set of laws designed to prevent the assimilation of the Normans into Irish society by requiring English subjects in Ireland to speak English, follow English customs and abide by English law. By the end of the 15th century, central English authority in Ireland had all but disappeared, and a renewed Irish culture and language, albeit with Norman influences, was again dominant. English crown control remained relatively unshaken in an amorphous foothold around Dublin known as the Pale, and under the provisions of Poyning's Law of 1494, Irish parliamentary legislation was subject to the approval of the English Privy Council. The Kingdom of Ireland. The title of King of Ireland was recreated in 1542 by Henry VIII, the then King of England, of the Tudor dynasty. English rule was reinforced and expanded in Ireland during the latter part of the 16th century, leading to the Tudor conquest of Ireland. A near-complete conquest was achieved by the turn of the 17th century, following the 9 Years' War and the flight of the Earls. This control was consolidated during the wars and conflicts of the 17th century, including the English and Scottish colonization in the plantations of Ireland, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms and the Williamite War. Irish losses during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms which, in Ireland, included the Irish Confederacy and the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland are estimated to include 20,000 battlefield casualties. 200,000 civilians are estimated to have died as a result of a combination of war-related famine, displacement, guerrilla activity, and pestilence throughout the war. A further 50,000 were sent into indentured servitude in the West Indies. Physician General William Petty estimated that 504,000 Catholic Irish and 112,000 Protestant settlers died, and 100,000 people were transported, as a result of the war. If a pre-war population of 1.5 million is assumed, this would mean that the population was reduced by almost half. The religious struggles of the 17th century left a deep sectarian division in Ireland. Religious allegiance now determined the perception in law of loyalty to the Irish King and Parliament. After the passing of the Test Act 1672, and the victory of the forces of the dual monarchy of William and Mary over the Jacobites, Roman Catholics, and non-conforming Protestant dissenters were barred from sitting as members in the Irish Parliament. Under the emerging penal laws, Irish Roman Catholics and dissenters were increasingly deprived of various civil rights, even the ownership of hereditary property. Additional regressive punitive legislation followed in 1703, 1709 and 1728. This completed a comprehensive systemic effort to materially disadvantage Roman Catholics and Protestant dissenters while enriching a new ruling class of Anglican conformists. The new Anglo-Irish ruling class became known as the Protestant Ascendancy. The Great Frost struck Ireland and the rest of Europe between December 1739 and September 1741, after a decade of relatively mild winters. The winters destroyed stored crops of potatoes and other staples, and the poor summers severely damaged harvests. This resulted in the famine of 1740. An estimated 250,000 people, about 1 in 8 of the population, died from the ensuing pestilence and disease. The Irish government halted export of corn and kept the army in quarters but did little more. Local gentry and charitable organizations provided relief but could do little to prevent the ensuing mortality. In the aftermath of the famine, an increase in industrial production and a surge in trade brought a succession of construction booms. The population soared in the latter part of the century and the architectural legacy of Georgian Ireland was built. In 1782, Poyning's Law was repealed, giving Ireland legislative independence from Great Britain for the first time since 1495. The British government, however, still retained the right to nominate the Government of Ireland without the consent of the Irish Parliament. 1798 Rebellion. In 1798, members of the Protestant dissenter tradition, mainly Presbyterian, made common cause with Roman Catholics in a Republican rebellion inspired and led by the Society of United Irishmen, with the aim of creating an independent Ireland. Despite assistance from France, the rebellion was put down by British and Irish government and yeomanry forces. The rebellion lasted from the 24th of May to the 12th of October that year and saw the establishment of the short-lived Irish Republic in the province on Connaught. It saw numerous battles across the island with an estimated 30,000 dead. Union with Great Britain. As a direct result of the 1798 rebellion in its aftermath in 1800, the British and Irish parliaments both passed Acts of Union that, with effect from January 1, 1801, merged the Kingdom of Ireland and the Kingdom of Great Britain to create a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The passage of the Act in the Irish Parliament was ultimately achieved with substantial majorities, having failed on the first attempt in 1799. According to contemporary documents and historical analysis, this was achieved through a considerable degree of bribery, with funding provided by the British Secret Service Office, and the awarding of peerages, places, and honours to secure votes. Thus, the Parliament in Ireland was abolished and replaced by a united Parliament at Westminster in London, though resistance remained, as evidenced by Robert Emmet's failed Irish Rebellion of 1803. Aside from the development of the linen industry, Ireland was largely passed over by the Industrial Revolution, partly because it lacked coal and iron resources and partly because of the impact of the sudden union with the structurally superior economy of England, which saw Ireland as a source of agricultural produce and capital. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1851 devastated Ireland, as in those years Ireland's population fell by 1/3. More than 1 million people died from starvation and disease, with an additional million people emigrating during the famine, mostly to the United States and Canada. In the century that followed, an economic depression caused by the famine resulted in a further million people emigrating. By the end of the decade, half of all immigration to the United States was from Ireland. The period of civil unrest that followed until the end of the 19th century is referred to as the Land War. Mass emigration became deeply entrenched and the population continued to decline until the mid-20th century. Immediately prior to the famine, the population was recorded as 8.2 million by the 1841 census. The population has never returned to this level since. The population continued to fall until 1961. County Leitrim was the final Irish county to record a population increase post-famine, in 2006. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of modern Irish nationalism, primarily among the Roman Catholic population. The preeminent Irish political figure after the Union was Daniel O'Connell. He was elected as Member of Parliament for Ennis in a surprise result and despite being unable to take his seat as a Roman Catholic. O'Connell spearheaded a vigorous campaign that was taken up by the Prime Minister, the Irish-born soldier and statesman, the Duke of Wellington. Steering the Catholic Relief Bill through Parliament, aided by future Prime Minister Robert Peel, Wellington prevailed upon a reluctant George IV to sign the bill and proclaim it into law. George's father had opposed the plan of the earlier Prime Minister, Pitt the Younger, to introduce such a bill following the Union of 1801, fearing Catholic emancipation to be in conflict with the Act of Settlement 1701. Daniel O'Connell led a subsequent campaign, for the repeal of the Act of Union, which failed. Later in the century, Charles Stewart Parnell and others campaigned for autonomy within the Union, or Home Rule. Unionists, especially those located in Ulster, were strongly opposed to Home Rule, which they thought would be dominated by Catholic interests. After several attempts to pass a Home Rule bill through Parliament, it looked certain that one would finally pass in 1914. To prevent this from happening, the Ulster Volunteers were formed in 1913 under the leadership of Edward Carson. Their formation was followed in 1914 by the establishment of the Irish Volunteers, whose aim was to ensure that the Home Rule Bill was passed. The Act was passed but with the temporary exclusion of the 6 counties of Ulster, which later became Northern Ireland. Before it could be implemented, however, the Act was suspended for the duration of the First World War. The Irish Volunteers split into 2 groups. The majority, approximately 175,000 in number, under John Redmond, took the name National Volunteers and supported Irish involvement in the war. A minority, approximately 13,000, retained the Irish Volunteers name and opposed Ireland's involvement in the war. The Easter Rising of 1916 was carried out by the latter group together with a smaller socialist militia, the Irish Citizen Army. The British response, executing 15 leaders of the rising over a period of 10 days and imprisoning or interning more than 1,000 people, turned the mood of the country in favor of the rebels. Support for Irish republicanism increased further due to the ongoing war in Europe, as well as the conscription crisis of 1918. The pro-independence Republican Party, Sinn Féin, received overwhelming endorsement in the general election of 1918, and in 1919 proclaimed an Irish Republic, setting up its own parliament and government. Simultaneously, the Volunteers, which became known as the Irish Republican Army, launched a 3-year guerrilla war, which ended in a truce in July 1921. Partition. In December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was concluded between the British government and representatives of the Second Dáil. It gave Ireland complete independence in its home affairs and practical independence for foreign policy, but an opt-out clause allowed Northern Ireland to remain within the United Kingdom, which it immediately exercised. Additionally, members of the Free State Parliament were required to swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State and make a statement of faithfulness to the King. Disagreements over these provisions led to a split in the nationalist movement and a subsequent Irish Civil War between the new government of the Irish Free State and those opposed to the treaty, led by Eamon de Valera. The Civil War officially ended in May 1923 when de Valera issued a ceasefire order. Independence. During its first decade, the newly formed Irish Free State was governed by the victors of the Civil War. When de Valera achieved power, he took advantage of the Statute of Westminster and political circumstances to build upon inroads to greater sovereignty made by the previous government. The oath was abolished and in 1937 a new constitution was adopted. This completed a process of gradual separation from the British Empire that governments had pursued since independence. However, it was not until 1949 that the state was declared, officially, to be the Republic of Ireland. The state was neutral during World War II, but offered clandestine assistance to the Allies, particularly in the potential defense of Northern Ireland. Despite their country's neutrality, approximately 50,000 volunteers from independent Ireland joined the British forces during the war, for being awarded Victoria Crosses. The German intelligence was also active in Ireland. Its operations ended in September 1941 when police made arrests based on surveillance carried out on the key diplomatic legations in Dublin. To the authorities, counterintelligence was a fundamental line of defense. With a regular army of only slightly over 7,000 men at the start of the war, and with limited supplies of modern weapons, the state would have had great difficulty in defending itself from invasion from either side in the conflict. Large-scale emigration marked most of the post-World War II period, particularly during the 1950s and 1980s, but beginning in 1987 the economy improved, and the 1990s saw the beginning of substantial economic growth. This period of growth became known as the Celtic Tiger. The Republic's real GDP grew by an average of 9.6% per annum between 1995 and 1999, in which year the Republic joined the Euro. In 2000, it was the sixth richest country in the world in terms of GDP per capita. Historian R.F. Foster argues the cause was a combination of a new sense of initiative and the entry of American corporations. He concludes the chief factors were low taxation, pro-business regulatory policies, and a young, tech-savvy workforce. For many multinationals, the decision to do business in Ireland was made easier still by generous incentives from the Industrial Development Authority. In addition, European Union membership was helpful, giving the country lucrative access to markets that it had previously reached only through the United Kingdom, and pumping huge subsidies and investment capital into the Irish economy. Modernization brought secularization in its wake. The traditionally high levels of religiosity have sharply declined. Foster points to three factors. First, Irish feminism, largely imported from America with liberal stances on contraception, abortion, and divorce, undermined the authority of bishops and priests. Second, the mishandling of the pedophile scandals humiliated the Church, whose bishops seemed less concerned with the victims and more concerned with covering up for errant priests. Third, prosperity brought hedonism and materialism that undercut the ideals of saintly poverty. The financial crisis that began in 2008 dramatically ended this period of boom. GDP fell by 3% in 2008 and by 7% in 2009, the worst year since records began. The state has since experienced deep recession, with unemployment, which doubled during 2009, remaining above 14% in 2012. Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland resulted from the division of the United Kingdom by the Government of Ireland Act 1920, and until 1972 was a self-governing jurisdiction within the United Kingdom with its own parliament and prime minister. Northern Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom, was not neutral during the Second World War, and Belfast suffered 4 bombing raids in 1941. Conscription was not extended to Northern Ireland, and roughly an equal number volunteered from Northern Ireland as volunteered from the Republic of Ireland. Although Northern Ireland was largely spared the strife of the Civil War, in the decades that followed partition there were sporadic episodes of intercommunal violence. Nationalists, mainly Roman Catholic, wanted to unite Ireland as an independent republic, whereas Unionists, mainly Protestant, wanted Northern Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom. The Protestant and Catholic communities in Northern Ireland voted largely along sectarian lines, meaning that the government of Northern Ireland elected by first past the post from 1929 was controlled by the Ulster Unionist Party. Over time, the minority Catholic community felt increasingly alienated with further disaffection fueled by practices such as gerrymandering and discrimination in housing and employment. In the late 1960s, nationalist grievances were aired publicly in mass civil rights protests, which were often confronted by loyalist counter-protests. The government's reaction to confrontations was seen to be one-sided and heavy-handed in favor of Unionists. Law and order broke down as unrest and intercommunal violence increased. The Northern Ireland government requested the British Army to aid the police and protect the Irish nationalist population. In 1969, the paramilitary Provisional IRA, which favoured the creation of a united Ireland, emerged from a split in the Irish Republican Army and began a campaign against what it called the British occupation of the Six Counties. Other groups, both the Unionist and Nationalist, participated in violence, and a period known as the Troubles began. Over 3,600 deaths resulted over the subsequent 3 decades of conflict. Owing to the civil unrest during the Troubles, the British government suspended Home Rule in 1972 and imposed direct rule. There were several unsuccessful attempts to end the Troubles politically, such as the Sunningdale Agreement of 1973. In 1998, following a ceasefire by the Provisional IRA and multi-party talks, the Good Friday Agreement was concluded as a treaty between the British and Irish governments, annexing the text agreed in the multi-party talks. The substance of the agreement, formally referred to as the Belfast Agreement, was later endorsed by referendums in both parts of Ireland. The agreement restored self-government to Northern Ireland on the basis of power sharing in a regional executive drawn from the major parties in a new Northern Ireland Assembly, with entrenched protections for the 2 main communities. The executive is jointly headed by a First Minister and Deputy First Minister drawn from the Unionist and Nationalist parties. Violence had decreased greatly after the Provisional IRA and Loyalist ceasefires in 1994, and in 2005 the Provisional IRA announced the end of its armed campaign and an independent commission supervised its disarmament and that of other nationalist and unionist paramilitary organizations. The Assembly and power-sharing executive were suspended several times but were restored again in 2007. In that year the British government officially ended its military support of the police in Northern Ireland and began withdrawing troops. On June 27, 2012, Northern Ireland's Deputy First Minister and former IRA commander, Martin McGuinness, shook hands with Queen Elizabeth II in Belfast, symbolizing reconciliation between the 2 sides. Politics. The island is divided between the Republic of Ireland, an independent state, and Northern Ireland, a constituent country of the United Kingdom. They share an open border and both are part of the common travel area, and as a consequence, there is free movement of people, goods, services, and capital across the border. The Republic of Ireland is a member state of the European Union while the United Kingdom is a former member state, having both acceded to its precursor entity, the European Economic Community, in 1973, but the UK left the European Union in 2020 after a referendum on EU membership was held in 2016, which resulted in 51.9% of UK voters choosing to leave the bloc. Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is a parliamentary democracy based on the Westminster system, with a written constitution and a popularly elected president whose role is mostly ceremonial. The Oireachtas is a bicameral parliament, composed of Dáil Éireann, a House of Representatives, and Sinead Éireann, an upper house. The government is headed by a prime minister, the Taoiseach, who is appointed by the President on the nomination of the Dáil. Its capital is Dublin. The Republic of Ireland today ranks among the wealthiest countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita, and in 2015 was ranked the 6th most developed nation in the world by the United Nations Human Development Index. A period of rapid economic expansion from 1995 onwards became known as the Celtic Tiger period, was brought to an end in 2008 with an unprecedented financial crisis and an economic depression in 2009. Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom with a local executive and assembly which exercise devolved powers. The executive is jointly headed by the First and Deputy First Minister, with the ministries being allocated in proportion to each party's representation in the Assembly. Its capital is Belfast. Ultimately, political power is held by the UK government, from which Northern Ireland has gone through intermittent periods of direct rule during which devolved powers have been suspended. Northern Ireland elects 18 of the UK House of Commons 650 MPs. The Northern Ireland Secretary is a cabinet-level post in the British government. Along with England and Wales and with Scotland, Northern Ireland forms one of the three separate legal jurisdictions of the UK, all of which share the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom as their court of final appeal. Languages. The two official languages of the Republic of Ireland are Irish and English. Each language has produced noteworthy literature. Irish, though now only the language of a minority, was the vernacular of the Irish people for thousands of years and was possibly introduced during the Iron Age. It began to be written down after Christianization in the 5th century and spread to Scotland and the Isle of Man, where it evolved into the Scottish Gaelic and Manx languages respectively. The Irish language has a vast treasury of written texts from many centuries and is divided by linguists into Old Irish from the 6th to 10th century, Middle Irish from the 10th to 13th century, Early Modern Irish until the 17th century, and the Modern Irish spoken today. It remained the dominant language of Ireland for most of those periods, having influences from Latin, Old Norse, French, and English. It declined under British rule but remained the majority tongue until the early 19th century, and since then has been a minority language. The Gaelic revival of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had a long-term influence. Irish is taught in mainstream Irish schools as a compulsory subject, but teaching methods have been criticized for their ineffectiveness, with most students showing little evidence of fluency even after 14 years of instruction. There is now a growing population of urban Irish speakers in both the Republic and Northern Ireland, especially in Dublin and Belfast, with the children of such Irish speakers sometimes attending Irish medium schools. It has been argued that they tend to be more highly educated than monolingual English speakers. Recent research suggests that urban Irish is developing in a direction of its own, both in pronunciation and grammar. Traditional rural Irish-speaking areas, known collectively as the Gaeltacht, are in linguistic decline. The main Gaeltacht areas are in the west, southwest and northwest, in Galway, Mayo, Donegal, western Cork and Kerry, with smaller Gaeltacht areas near Dungarvan in Waterford and in Meath. English in Ireland was first introduced during the Norman invasion. It was spoken by a few peasants and merchants brought over from England and was largely replaced by Irish before the Tudor conquest of Ireland. It was introduced as the official language during the Tudor and Cromwellian conquests. The Ulster plantations gave it a permanent foothold in Ulster, and it remained the official and upper-class language elsewhere, the Irish-speaking chieftains and nobility having been deposed. Language shift during the 19th century replaced Irish with English as the first language for a vast majority of the population. Fewer than 2% of the population of the Republic of Ireland today speak Irish on a daily basis, and under 10% regularly, outside of the education system, and 38% of those over 15 years are classified as Irish speakers. In Northern Ireland, English is the de facto official language, but official recognition is afforded to Irish, including specific protective measures under Part 3 of the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. A lesser status including recognition under Part 2 of the Charter is given to Ulster Scots dialects, which are spoken by roughly 2% of Northern Ireland residents, and also spoken by some in the Republic of Ireland. Since the 1960s, with the increase in immigration, many more languages have been introduced, particularly deriving from Asia and Eastern Europe. Also native to Ireland are Shuilta, the language of the nomadic Irish travellers, Irish Sign Language, and Northern Ireland Sign Language. Culture. Ireland's culture comprises elements of the culture of ancient peoples, later immigrant and broadcast cultural influences. In broad terms, Ireland is regarded as one of the Celtic nations of Europe, alongside Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Isle of Man and Brittany. This combination of cultural influences is visible in the intricate designs termed Irish interlace or Celtic knotwork. These can be seen in the ornamentation of medieval religious and secular works. The style is still popular today in jewelry and graphic art, as is the distinctive style of traditional Irish music and dance, and has become indicative of modern Celtic culture in general. Religion has played a significant role in the cultural life of the island since ancient times, and since the 17th century plantations, has been the focus of political identity and divisions on the island. Ireland's pre-Christian heritage fused with the Celtic Church following the missions of St. Patrick in the 5th century. The Hiberno-Scottish missions, begun by the Irish monk St. Columba, spread the Irish vision of Christianity to pagan England and the Frankish Empire. These missions brought written language to an illiterate population of Europe during the Dark Ages that followed the fall of Rome, earning Ireland the sobriquet, the Island of Saints and Scholars. Since the 20th century, Irish pubs worldwide have become outposts of Irish culture, especially those with a full range of cultural and gastronomic offerings. Economy. The GDP of the Republic of Ireland as of 2021 was €423.5 billion, and in Northern Ireland in 2021, it was £52 billion. The GDP per capita in the Republic of Ireland was €84,049.90 as of 2021, and in Northern Ireland 2021 was £27,154. The Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom measure these numbers differently. Despite the two jurisdictions using two distinct currencies, a growing amount of commercial activity is carried out on an all-Ireland basis. This has been facilitated by the two jurisdictions' former shared membership of the European Union, and there have been calls from members of the business community and policy makers for the creation of an all-Ireland economy to take advantage of economies of scale and boost competitiveness.